Hello, good evening, and welcome. I'm Simon Bestwick.
And I am Gemma Files. And this, of course, is No
No
Darkness
darkness but
But
ours.
Ours.
In our last podcast, we dug more deeply into the roots of folk horror, casting our eye over examples of it from Alan Garner's Red Shift and the Owl Service to Netflix's recent film adaptations of Dolores Redondo's Baztan trilogy. Then the discussion turned to more traditional folkloric monsters like werewolves and vampires.
You know, actually, I've been listening to this interesting history of serial killers called Sons of Cain. And let's see, who wrote that? Peter somebody. Yeah, just a sec. Yeah, Sons of Cain by Peter Vronsky. And I'm not sure I completely believe all of his theories, but essentially he is putting forth the thesis that when you look back at the history of monsters or rumors of monsters or monster mythology, that a lot of the time people could have been talking about serial killers. And that serial killer behavior is something that is sort of like, like a genetic crossed wire that is left over from when one species of humans ingested another species of humans, back when we weren't, totally different from animals. We were, we were predators.
Kind of your
We were, literally predators, sort of like bears.
Although I do love, somebody did once raise the point, it kind of, supposedly, Grendel would like tear off the doors at Heros and storm in every night and kill loads of people. And it's like, somebody said, this kind of begs the question of how the hell does Hrothgar keep persuading people to come to his parties? Because this shit goes on for years, and he never runs out of mead. And
that's why. Obviously, his mead was like super good. And it's like, on the one hand, it is possible that if we go and we drink with Hrothgar, that Grendel will come in and kill us while we are completely drunk and asleep. On the other hand, it'll be over pretty quick. And his meat is so good. And he mentions Grendel, actually. He's like, it's like,
well, yeah, so, the Sons of Cain is actually described, I think, in
yes, he's described as a son of Cain. And and yeah, I mean, this sense of, these people being like leftovers from the old world, the very, very old world, the very old world of deep time. And at one point he says, when you think about the two typical monsters, right, that you hear about all the time, you've got werewolves and you've got vampires. And vampires are sort of like organized serial killers, and werewolves are sort of like disorganized.
Yeah, when you put it like that, that does kind of work. Incidentally, something else. I mean, I was thinking of it before when you mentioned in 30 Days of Night, the old guy who's like so, who hardly ever comes into town, and his only interactions when he gets given parking tickets. And it's almost to remind him that there's a Manly Wade Wellman story called Yeah, and it's essentially around this guy who sort of like repudiated mankind altogether and just decided he preferred the wild, living in the wild woods. And basically the idea is he's kind of just as like a dog might go wild and become something more like a wolf. Yes. So this guy, has become something that it's grown, has not as evolved, devolved, or sideways evolved into this kind of monstrous primal kind of creature. Who had hated tame mankind, I think, is the story.
Wellman did some amazing stuff, and I seem to recall he also did one which was literally about a werewolf who was just a guy who would get this urge to act like a wolf and destroy everybody who was around him. he also came up with the best spin on werewolf/vampire mythology I've ever heard of, which is the idea that if you kill a werewolf and you don't burn the body, they turn into a vampire. People don't use it enough, I'll tell you that much, because I would use it all the time if I was writing something like that.
Incidentally, just thought of another I mean, I don't know if it's I think it's another possible candidate for folk horror. And that's straw dogs.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, another way to look at folk horror is the horror of other folk. It's like there's now as queer as folk, especially when they rape and kill you.
And there's a horror, but there's the horror as well of what's inside you. I mean, it's that when they get away to that village, it's ultimately something that, I mean, the marriage between the Dustin Hoffman and Susan George characters was obviously something. It was obviously askew from the beginning, but it under those pressures in that isolated environment, that isolation forces you again to face a lot of stuff. In a way, I was thinking before, in a way, if you're living. Another difference is if you're living in the country, you're going to need a certain amount of physical, not necessarily strength, but a physical capacity to be able to do stuff. Yes. It's just because you're forced back on your own resources. But again, there's also this code of masculinity there that by the standards of which Dustin Hoffman's character is just a complete failure, even despite his whatever his intelligence, and in a way he kind of goes to this. It's almost like a rite of passage where he becomes a man, but of course at what cost, both psychologically. But it is that thing where he kind of he has to kind of realize both in the sense of know it's there and make it a reality, his own capacity for violence in order to survive. But so the horror in that sense is within, because he's become a man, he's worthy of respect by whatever standards prevail in that film. But what is he? He's still an outsider there, and the only person in his marriage is basically over. And as he drives away with David Warner, David Warner goes, "I don't know where to live," and he goes, "That's okay, neither do I."
Yeah, it's true. And, it's that process of starting out an outsider and becoming an insider by going to this atavistic place, this older place in yourself and saying, I peel away civilization. I peel away my city self, and I reshape myself to the country where all atavism comes from. There's another thing that occurs to me, mainly because you said Susan George, and I believe she was in this, The Witches, the 1967 film. 1968. 1966. Yeah, 1966. Sorry. Also, which is based on The Devil's Own by Nora Lofts.
Right.
Yeah, the Hammer one. Sorry, 1966. It's 1966. Blah blah blah. Okay, so basically, no, she's not in that. But we begin with Joan Fontaine as Miss Mayfield, who has been in Africa and has developed she's dealing with great PTSD because her bunch of people in Africa were attacked by like a witch doctor and people wearing masks. So she flees this type of folk horror to go back to Britain, to England, and a tiny little village presided over by Alan and Stephanie Bax. Alan Bax is they're like the local landholders, and Alan Bax is the local minister. But the village is actually full of deep-rooted witchcraft of a very folk horror type. It's very obvious that the coven that exists in this village goes all the way back to primeval times, and there's this real sense of deep historic time and deep historic ties and resonance. And Kay Walsh as Stephanie Bax sort of wants Joan Fontaine to join her as and become like the second guiding light of the coven. I think she kind of feels like she's a magician. It's like she's been studying actual occultism. Unlike these rancid peasant witches all around her.
Yeah.
So she's like manipulating them to get what she wants, but really it's all the same thing. And this is what Miss Mayfield, Joan Fontaine, eventually confronts her with. It's like, no, you are exactly like them. You are, in that you are a greedy, selfish person who wants to manipulate the world around you through ritual magic, and is perfectly willing to literally as well as figuratively sacrifice actual human beings to get what you want. And I mean, certainly there's something kind of creepy and colonialist and dare I say racist about the backstory that Joan Fontaine comes in with, but at the same time it really does spin on that observation of Conrad's observations that this too was once one of the dark places of the world, that everywhere you go has its own heart of darkness, that everywhere you go.
To the Romans, this was kind of like the
try and imagine being a Roman, who's thrown into the heart of darkest Britain and going, what the hell?
Well, I think you wrote a story about that, didn't you?
I did, yes.
Can't remember the title off the top of my head, but I remember liking
Sent Down.
That was it. I knew it was about something involving the word down.
The Roman. She speaks through me, Roman. Yes.
I think we've said before that there was this very fertile thing of and kind of there's a sort of an ambiguity to it of a lot of that whole kind of subgenre of horror fiction, which is set in the colonism, which involves sort of some usually upper class English type going snorting and going a fig for your silly native superstitions, and then the hard way how those silly superstitions are not silly at all, and the natives actually know a damn sight more than him about something. So there's kind of on the one hand, it's that thing of any culture that tries to supplant another, it demonizes the culture it's trying to displace.
That's exactly it. And that can even work with things like the Indonesian movie May the Devil Take You, where the devil in that particular case is setan, and you get this collision between Muslim religion and this older sense of worshipping jinn and worshipping animism and just this much older set of folkloric laws and resonances.
What gets me with that sort of subgenre of fiction, as I said, on one hand, it's that kind of demonizing of the old culture. On the other hand, there's also this kind of thing which kind of subverts that, where that old culture kind of strikes back at the colonizer in a way that kind of often lays the colonizer know they're in danger of it, but also kind of humbles them and makes them realize actually your colonial view of the world, where your culture is superior and knows everything, isn't the be all and end all. There are things that these people you look down on know that you don't and understand better than you. I mean, Wakefield's, I think we've mentioned this before, Wakefield's Gorge of the Churels is a particularly brilliant example of this.
Yes. It's like,
where it's only the intervention of an Indian servant who utterly despises his pompous, condescending Christian missionary
masters.
Yeah,
just like, well, I suppose I should make sure that the Churel does not eat the child, whatever.
Yeah, it's kind of that thing where he kind of, it's kind of like he if it was just them, he wouldn't necessarily mind that, but he stopped short of allowing that to fall upon the head of someone who's actually innocent, and hasn't actually, isn't actually responsible for any of that. And we can find, we find a lot of stories like that, and it's, as I said, there's that duality to them, which on the one hand seems to affirm the idea of the indigenous culture as something that's sort of dreadful, but at the same time subverts the idea of the colonizer's superiority. I mean,
absolutely. So here's a question. Sredni Vashtar, would you say that is a form of folk horror, even though the god Sredni Vashtar is something that our main character makes up, but it's based on his absolute love for this vicious little weasel, right? This.
It's an interesting one. I don't know if it would come on. I mean, I know we're trying to cast our definition as broadly as possible, but
because I think it can be cast as broadly as possible. I think it, I personally think that all horror feeds into all other horror.
Oh God, yeah. I mean, this is always the problem when you're trying to sort of look at a particular.
But when you think about it, it's like pure animism, right? He finds the weasel. It's anger and it's fierceness and its rage to destroy is so attractive to him, because it is like pure power, pure potential. And he has no power at all,
Exactly. It is an invented religion. It's a way to, it's a creation of a sort of secret knowledge. It goes back to, in a way, to what we were saying before about how the sort of the folklore could sometimes actually, in the context of that isolated rural place, it could be a refuge from it. It could be a refuge from the panopticon, from the surveillance. It's a way, or a place for you to release all those desires that are condemned or suppressed, or
that's right. Every once in a while we go down in the cellar and cover ourselves in mud and have like a big mud orgy while Stephanie Bax recites weird poetry.
That sounds like an average Saturday night in some parts of the Whittle, to be fair. I mean, Sredni Vashtar is one of my all-time favourite short stories. And if you ever get the chance, there is a truly magnificent reading of it done by Tom Baker. Around the time he was playing Doctor Who, they did the BBC did a series of called Late Night Story, which was exactly what it says on the tin. I think there were 4 or 5 of them. They did 2 sets of them. There was one read by John Mills, which were around the theme of war, and I don't know much about them. But Tom Baker did 4 or 5 of them. There was a photograph by Nigel Neal, Nursery Tea by Mary Danby, The End of the Party by Graham Greene, and I can't remember if there was another one, but there was Sredni Vashtar by Saki, and it's an absolutely brilliant reading. I think because there is a very childlike aspect to Tom Baker, which is quite wonderful when you read a lot of the stuff, his autobiography or whatever, and so he's, I think there's a part of him that totally identifies with Conrad and in that story and is totally rooting for him and is extremely happy about what happens to Mrs. de Ropp in that story.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, this is again John Gardner, the guy who wrote Grendel.
Oh yeah.
Said in his version of King Arthur and his noble knights that the beginning of all witchcraft is when you're a tiny child stamping on a doll and saying, "That's for you, nursey." Yeah. That sense that you can call up something that will do what you can't. You can call upon some larger power, which, it doesn't have to be goety. It doesn't have to be like the devil. It has, but there are larger powers all around you, things that are uncontrollable when you are totally under somebody else's control. And all of us begin feeling like that. All of us begin as children who literally can't make any decisions for ourselves. It's like we're told when to poop, we're told when not to pee, we're told, when to eat and, what to do and what not to do and what to say and what not to say, right?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
In terms of being told what to say and what not to say, I never quite got the hang of that one.
Yeah, well, me either. I think you can tell.
Yes. Anyway. I mean, Saki, in many ways, I mean, he definitely had that child's point of view. There was definitely a part of him that really resented growing up. Although, of course, I think that he did have a deep vein of misogyny. And I believe he was raised largely by a couple of maiden aunts, which possibly which I don't know how much. I don't know if that contributed to why to his misogyny, or just or possibly contributed to his hatred of his resentment of parental authority figures. But yeah, he was. There's definitely that identification with the kids there. But a number of his stories go into outright folk horror, like The Piece of Mousel Barton, or The Hounds of Fate, or The Music on the Hill. That could have been just as easily been written by Machen or Blackwood. Although it does have it does have that sort of very cruel wit that's distinctive to Saki. Yeah. I don't think we'd have liked him very much as a person if we'd met him, but he's enormous fun to read.
Yes.
And can really do the macabre extraordinarily well. I mean, but Sredni, I defy anyone to find any fault with a story like Sredni Vashtar. That is just
exactly.
That is just one of the. I mean, if I could write something as good as that, I will be like, okay, that's fine. I can die contented.
Yeah, and so just to brush past this again, these part of folk horror is where mythology comes from, and this sense that if you go back far enough, you can find explanations for why we tell stories about giants and why we tell stories about trolls and why we tell stories about werewolves and why we tell stories about fairies, I don't actually think that it's reductionist to say that, maybe we tell stories about fairies because there were people who disappeared, under the hills, maybe, or back into the woods, people who sort of went, like the green children of Westeros, the people who sort of went, no, fuck it. It's like, I'm not going to deal with those people anymore. I'm just going to.
One of the legend, one of the sort of mythological things that I think this kind of like these claims went on into medieval times was the woodwolves, the wild man of the woods. These presumably people who were still he was supposedly still living in a semi-wild state, and you wonder how many survivals of, relics perhaps of earlier sort of versions of humanity or hominin populations might have lingered on into comparatively recent, into living memory. Of course, some versions, Arthur Machen in the novel of The Black Seal casts the idea of the fairy as, these, they're not only are they not these cute little things with wings or whatever, they're not even the fae of myth. They're these horribly evil monsters who have drawn apart. And another one, of course, would be Robert E. Howard's Worms of the Earth.
Yes.
It's an absolutely brilliant.
Which again, goes back to, the Celtic idea of, there were these people who were so awful, we just had to get rid of them.
Again, this is, so in so many, as I think we've said before, human history is in many ways a great, there's an awful lot of it is one form of ethnic cleansing or genocide or another. And yes, there would be an awful lot of post hoc rationalization of that. And so, as with every other culture that you that you displace or destroy, there's that element of demonization. Just as when you fight a war, you need propaganda to paint your enemies as something that to convince yourself that your enemies are worthy of destruction, deserve to be destroyed.
Yeah, because otherwise you're just gonna be continually bitch slapped with the realization that no, they're just people. They're just people like you and me. They have partners, they have children, they have families, and they have reasons for what they do. They
have to rationalize their humanity away in order to do stuff like that. And so after the fact that continues, but there is also that thing of, like, after any sort of act done in the heat of the moment, you can start to feel bad. If you feel bad about it afterwards, then people will either repress all knowledge of it, or they will find rationalizations for it. They'll find ways to justify stuff.
So the horror of folk horror is the twofold realization that atavism lies under everything, and part of where it lies under your own sense of yourself, that you are not that different from whoever it is that you think is superlatively different from you. And, depending on where you grow up, depending on what you grow up believing, depending on what you find useful for yourself, you could find yourself in a completely, you could find yourself burning some policeman in a wicker man and going, summer is a coming in. Ludley sing cuckoo. And being like, I'm fine with it. That guy was a dick.
And because this is such an incredibly rich and varied thing. We haven't. There are specific areas where we could talk in great. I think the work of David Rudkin probably deserves a whole.
Oh, hell yeah!
Penda's Fen and there's also a short film that Rudkin directed himself called White Lady, which is another very disturbing slice of folk horror. And he did a number of short audio dramas called Place Prints, all kind of inspired by different parts of the British landscape. And there's this film, as I said, there's the film Artemis 81, which, while not folk horror per se, is still, an extraordinary original and ambitious work. So Penda's Fen would almost certainly have to be the starting point, because that is one of the classic unsung works of brilliance.
That's a crazy film, and I love it. It's just so good.
The fact that the school friend that he has a deeply repressed attraction to is actually called Honeybone. It's kind of like, okay, David, that's not you're not even being subtle with this one here, are you?
Be dark and pure and vile.
Yes.
Yeah. It's like all of that is your birthright. That's the idea, that not only the stuff on top, but all the stuff that's underneath the stuff on top is your birthright as as someone who comes from this particular area, as someone who comes from Yeah. Yeah. As a child of Penda. and you can't extricate yourself from it. And and I find that kind of great, actually, in a weird way. The fact that you can't extricate yourself from human history. In
many ways, I mean, in fact, in many ways, it isn't a lot of folk horror about bringing people down a peg or two who think they can. Who think that they can just kind of cut themselves adrift from all of that. I mean, we have this. I mean, I think M. John Harrison said that when he wrote his novel Signs of Life, that what a big part of that was trying to take apart, one of the kind of prevalent myths of the time, which was you can be anything you want to be.
Yeah.
There are no limits, in that sense. And it's like, well, no, there are constraints. It sucks to have to kind of admit them. What you do about those boundaries and those constraints is entirely up to you. You can push them, extend them, whatever. But I mean, in Signs of Life, he gives his characters yearnings that are literally impossible. Like Isabel Avens literally wants to fly, not in a plane, but to literally fly, literally like a bird.
Yes.
And that's just something that cannot be done.
Yep.
Whatever they promise her. I mean, in that sense with folk horror, there is that thing of, no, you're not just this original special creation, a tabula rasa that you just write upon. You have all this stuff, you have all this baggage, and in some respects, like a lot of other things, deserve has nothing to do with it. It may not be fair that you have all this baggage, because you can inherit, of course, depending on what part of the world you live in, you can be inheriting half a dozen fucking vendettas that you want no part of. If you live in some parts of the, I mean, if you live in the Balkans, you live in somewhere like the fucking Yugoslavia, holy motherfucking shit. You have got a whole bunch of stuff that you don't want to be part of. You may have other plans, but you can't just wish all that shit away. But of course, actually recognizing those roots, those things, and acknowledging them can actually make you stronger and make you more capable of being your own person, because you can see where the influences are coming from, and that all this stuff that you thought was just your own perfectly original thought was actually something that's rooted in your cultural conditioning, in your heritage, for want of a better term.
Absolutely. And thus we return again and again to the plight of the orphan, the plight of the adoptee who knows nothing of their history and their birthright and their genetics even, and how so often that can be the beginning of a story, which can go in some pretty dark areas, some pretty dark directions. If you're in an
H.P. Lovecraft story, you can forget about you can forget about finding out anything good.
Well, I mean, on the one hand, you're eventually gonna have some super poppy eyes, but on the other hand, you won't have to die.
Yeah, I think somebody once pointed out to me that you were stuffed either way, because on the one hand, in stories like The Shadow over Innsmouth, the ultimate horror was miscegenation, and you'd become like a bug-eyed monster. But then in The Lurking Fear, the other horror, if you didn't miscegenate, you become so inbred you turn into some sort of cannibal ape thing.
Yes, so exactly.
You were stuffed either.
Rats in the walls, basically. Yeah, the rats in the walls, it's like,
oh man,
pretty soon all you'll be able to eat are these pallid, flabby things, that aren't there anymore. So yeah, completely stuffed. Cut your friend's arms and legs off, and stick them down in the hollows underneath your house, and breed yourself some more meat.
Oh man, that was a hell of a good story.
It is.
Despite that bloody cat.
Yeah. Yes. Despite the cat's name. Despite the cat's name.
Yeah, there were a few times when I read, reading Lovecraft. I mean, you get used to a certain level of unthinking racism, or of racist tropes in a lot of even of widely respected authors. But you kind of gloss it. You kind of think, well, okay, certain prejudices were more widespread then, or yada yada yada. And then you read Lovecraft, and it's like, holy fucking shit!
Yeah, it's just like ka-chang. Oh man, come on.
People have said that they think Howard was a worse racist, and I don't think that's true at all. He may have used the N-word more, but he writes he at least writes POC characters who, however,
people.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're people, and he's actually really kind of in love with the idea of atavism. So, being supposedly less, civilized or supposedly less, evolved is not something that he dislikes. He actually likes it. You can accuse him of being Orientalist and a little bit fetishistic in that regard, but
I mean, there was no way Lovecraft would have written a character like Nolonga in the Solomon Kane books. Now, Nolonga is a quite literal magical Negro, yes, but at the same time, it's an attempt on Howard's part, however clumsy, however flawed by modern standards, to actually create. He's actually writing a black character who is, Kane does not think of Nolonga as lesser.
Not at all. Yeah, and in a way, the weirdness of Cain, this Cornish Puritan, it's like he's just as fetishistic in his depiction of Cain and his super specificity as he is of Nolonga. So yeah.
Of course, Cain wouldn't be a racist either. He'd see us all human beings equally as sort of groveling worms before the glory of the Lord, kind of.
That is exactly it. It's like, oh man, I once came across this amazing Tomb of Dracula story where Solomon Kane met Dracula.
That must have been fun.
Yeah. He like ends up, coming to Dracula's castle for the night and realizing that Dracula has turned this Puritan girl that he's been looking for into a vampire, and then they have like a sword fight.
Of course they do.
Yes, it's wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, of course, when it comes to, of course, there was Howard and there was Lovecraft, and then of course there was Clark Ashton Smith, who was just positively reveling in all the fun you could have with the weird shit.
Oh yes, yeah. Clark Ashton Smith is just on a whole nother level, level of oddness.
It's a wonderful story, and I'm not sure if I hope this is true. What possibly had to be the least successful first date in history was actually a letter from Lovecraft apparently to Smith. Where Lovecraft went on a date with a young woman called Helen Sully, which was probably some interest to Clark Ashton Smith, as he was banging Genevieve Sully, her mother. As Joel Lane once said, Clark Ashton Smith had several wives, none of them his own. But
that's awful.
Apparently, for this first date, Lovecraft took this poor woman to a cemetery, to a derelict cemetery, where he reclined upon a tomb and read the work of Edgar Allan Poe to her in a sepulchral voice until apparently she sort of finally ran away screaming. And I think he actually sort of said, "I'm not quite sure what I did wrong."
It's like, Howard, I cannot explain this to you.
There are some things that you do wonder if he sort of because Lovecraft did have some sort of sex life, didn't he? Eventually with Sonia Green, although you do
That's
sometimes.
What she said. That's what she said.
You do sometimes wonder if Clark Ashton Smith ever thought of sort of writing to some sense in news. How much do you think we should maybe just hire Howard a hooker or something? Just get him laid, and he might feel better.
Given what happened to his dad, I don't think that would be a smart idea.
True story. Turned him into even more of a gibbering wreck than.
You gave me syphilis. What kind of friends are you?
We told you to double bag it, Howard. I
Damn
don't
it.
know what the fuck that means.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my God, just lowering the tone of every conversation. That's me.
Every conversation.
Wonder
All right.
slightly-
Well, this is. I think this is it. Probably. What do you
Probably.
think?
There's probably more folk horror stuff we can
Oh,
talk
there's
about. There's probably
all
more.
sorts of more folk horror stuff that we can talk about. But I think that this has been pretty good in terms of trying to just sum up what folk horror is, what the attractions of folk horror are, and what to some degree the template of folk horror tends to be.
Yeah. Bottom line is, there's a lot of it around, and it's awesome.
Yeah, all of it's awesome. Find it, consume it, make it.
Okay. Well, you
Alright.
heard it here first, kids.
So that was the third and final instalment of our 3-part podcast about folk horror, but it won't be the last time we discuss the topic. We'll no doubt be returning to it in future podcasts because it's such a rich vein of horror, so why don't you let us know what you'd like to see? What haven't we discussed that we should have? What writers or films should we be talking about? Let us know, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the podcast, please feel free to make a donation through our Patreon or our Ko-Fi pages. Finally, if our discussion of the droving in our last podcast sparked your interest, then watch out or listen out for the upcoming special edition of the podcast where we'll be talking to its director, George Popov, and its star, Daniel Oldroyd.
Until then, I have been Simon Bestwick.
And I have been Gemma Files.
And this has been, of course, No
No
Darkness.
darkness but ours.